So good morning, everybody. I'd like to very quickly have you all tell me, and I'm sure you probably know each other, just a little bit about who you are, where you're working, and sort of what you're hoping to hear today or get out of today's session. So Molly, do you want to sort of call off folks as you see them?
Sure.
And Molly is helping me. Molly works with me here at Amos House, and she's my techie for the day.
So I'm just going to go as I see people. And first up is Brian Brothers.
Good morning. Brian Brothers, West Warwick Police Department. I'm currently the SRO at Deering Middle School. Just looking to get a little bit more information out of like mental health, how to work with the kids here.
Then next is S. Clark, which it looks like there are two of you.
Morning. My name is Sean Clark. I've been a police officer with South Kingstown for the last 16 years, currently serving at Curtis Corner and Broad Rock Middle Schools for the last 3. Just hoping to take some tactics away from this that we can apply in our daily course of action at schools.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm James Sagaroulis, the SRO at South Kingstown High School. Been on the force for 7 years. Just hoping to become more informed about mental health.
And before we go to Chris, who you are next, we have in the chat Brock Taylor saying that he doesn't have audio or camera today because he's in his office at school, but he's been 5 years serving at, I'm not from Rhode Island and I don't know how to
Richmond.
say this word.
He's from the Richmond Police Department.
Thank you. I have no idea. Thank you so much. But there's that. But Chris, you are next. Chris Rafferty.
Hi, Chris Rafferty. I'm East Greenwich Patrolman, the school resource officer, 26 years on the job, and I am the school resource officer for all of East Greenwich schools. So
Wow.
for elementary, middle school, and the high school. And just looking again to see what I can learn and take back to the students to try to assist them.
So David Neal.
Good morning. My name is Dave Neal. I retired from the state police after 25 years, currently working at the U.S. Attorney's Office doing crime prevention in substance abuse prevention, community outreach. Work very closely with Miko Lincoln, who Eileen Hayes introduced me to at the Amos House. And we have a group of presenters and a short opioid film that we planned to release prior to COVID. COVID hit, so we're waiting to get back into the schools to get that video. But I've also worked with Kathy and Heidi a lot, going into the middle and high schools, doing e-cigarette presentations and opioid presentations, and it's nice to see some of the familiar faces. So good morning.
And also in the chat, we've got AJ Medeiros from Coventry PD, worked there for 15 years and now working at a middle school as SRO. Also doesn't have audio or video. And then next is Alicio.
Wow, you got that right. Thank you.
Not usually.
I've been with the Wesley Police Department 21 years. The juvenile officer. I also cover the high school as the SRO.
James Bible.
Hi, Jim Viable. I'm the school resource officer for Tollgate High School in Warwick, Rhode Island.
Sophia.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm the municipal coordinator for South Kingstown Prevention.
Paul Struckle.
Good morning, Paul Strackel, North Kingstown Police, SRO. I've been a policeman for about 18 years. Thanks for having me.
Kevin O'Connor.
Morning, Kevin O'Connor, Narragansett Police Department. Been an officer for 10 years. This is my 3rd year as an SRO, primarily the middle school and elementary school. And looking forward to the training. One little perk is I'm glad that I'm not outside at the elementary school for 30 minutes right now. So it's nice, cool weather.
Joe Marshall.
Oh, hi, good morning. I'm on a Chromebook, if you can believe it. So I don't know how good it is for you guys to hear me, but 19 years on the job. I am the SRO at Vets Middle School and Windman. I'm floating back and forth. We only have 3 SROs right now in the city, so we're just jumping wherever we're needed. So we have our hands full. Thank you.
And then we also in the chat have Jay Randall, who's part of the SRO Youth Services team for the Warwick Police. And then next after Jill is Al Morano.
Hello, everybody.
SRO here at Pilgrim High School in Warwick. I also help out with elementary school, and I've been on the job for 14 years.
Ashley.
Hello, Ashley Adavaya. I am the municipal coordinator of the Westerly Prevention and Wellness Partnership. I also am a clinician for NAFI Rhode Island, and I'm wearing that hat today, hoping to get a little bit more information about ACEs in general and how I can work with our youth, because a lot of our youth probably overlap.
I think the only person left is Paul Dean.
Here.
All right.
Great.
All right, great.
I
Okay.
don't think I missed anyone, so there's that.
Anybody that we didn't identify or have check in?
Just to tell you, Officer Dean is from Block Island. So thanks for joining us from there.
You're welcome.
All right. Today we're going to be I know that we're talking next week about ACEs and the adverse childhood experiences and how to identify when you're working with young people, what their risk factors are. But we want to start with really talking about trauma and how in our work we can be trauma informed in the way that we approach the folks that we're working with. And trauma-informed care is the focus of today's presentation. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about trauma, the definitions of trauma. We're going to be talking about signs that you may see in the young folks that you're working with so that you can begin to identify those kids who have trauma. And we're going to be using videos that are focused on adults talking about their experiences as children. And the videos will be talking about sort of their childhood experiences and then sort of the different behaviors that they ultimately got involved in. And then a little bit towards the end, we're going to be hearing from a couple of folks about how their experiences with law enforcement that were trauma informed really made a difference in the outcomes of the interactions that they had. A lot of this work is coming from SAMHSA. They have a curriculum on speaking specifically about how to be trauma informed with folks that are involved in the justice system. So you're a great audience for this. And I'm not using the entire curriculum and as it's written, I'm using parts of it. So I can give you the reference to the training if it's something that you may be interested in going forward. In fact, right now, this week and then again next week, SAMHSA is doing this training for 10 law enforcement and 10 community members in Providence to create more people who were trained on how to deliver this information. So a little bit of background on me. I've been at Amos House for 20 years and I'm a clinical social worker by training. And for folks that don't know Amos House, we work with many men and women who have been incarcerated. And a lot of the work that we do is talking about sort of their life experiences and what led to their incarceration, and then helping them look at how to change their behavior so that they can have an impact on their own families. Many of the folks that we work with, unfortunately, ended up in the training school at very young ages and then went from the training school in and out of prison. And unfortunately, they have a lot of experience where they experienced tremendous amount of trauma as children. And so much of the work that you're doing is so crucial in hopefully breaking that cycle of the school to prison pipeline that we're so knowledgeable about, unfortunately. And we're working hard to change that trajectory. So this is the definition from SAMHSA. Individual trauma is when there's an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that a person experiences that leads to long-term physical, social, and emotional disorders in functioning. So it's an experience that's painful, stressing, or shocking, and that has long-term effects. So with trauma, there's both the experience and then how somebody reacts to the experience and then the long-term effects. I often talk too about trauma as being something outside of our ability to make sense of. when people have long-term trauma or even a major traumatic experience, they often don't have words to describe what's happened to them. And we know from brain research that trauma actually gets stored in a different part of our brain. We don't store trauma in our kind of memory, thinking, cognitive brain. We actually store it in our emotional brain, which is why we often see people reacting to things that don't seem to be understood about why right now somebody's having a meltdown over kind of an image or a smell or running into somebody that they haven't seen. And it's because that they may not have the words to describe their trauma, but they'll have the kind of the physical memory. We often talk about how the body keeps the score. Our bodies hold on to memories in ways different than maybe our ability to put words to it is. So trauma can also happen in two ways. There's the direct experiences when you've had your own traumatic event, whether it's a one-time thing like a car accident or kind of a flood or somebody that you love dying, or long-term chronic trauma like child abuse, child sexual abuse. Chronic trauma is often what we see a lot, where a person will have what they call polytrauma, where they might live in poverty, they might be exposed to violence, they might have seen somebody that they love get hurt. And all those things compile one on top of the other to create what's called complex trauma. But then there's also vicarious trauma, which I think this, sort of many of us in the field have experienced. I'm sure many of you as officers have experienced, where you have been witness to so much violence, so much hurt, so much pain that ultimately you begin to internalize that trauma and get sick or feel hopeless and maybe not feel like you want to come to work. and we're not really going to talk a whole lot about that today, but I want you to, as we go through the morning, really pay attention to your own experiences and how your own experiences may show up in your work with kids that you're working with. When we talk about trauma-informed care, we're really talking about what we as providers, as clinicians, as officers can do to create an environment in our schools and with the people that we're working with that is trauma informed. And these are kind of 10 principles. And probably the most important thing is really beginning with the understanding and recognition that trauma is universal, guaranteed that whatever school you're in, whatever district you're in, the kids that you're coming in contact with will have experienced trauma. The level of trauma may be different depending on each child's experience, and how that child experiences and manifests that trauma will be different. We're going to talk a little bit today also about trauma risk and trauma resilience. Many of us know people in our own lives or kids that we've worked with that are incredibly resilient to experiences that you or I might think we don't understand how they get through it. Part of it is really starting with the premise that guaranteed when you're walking into that classroom, 1 out of 4 of those kids are going to have experienced some sort of trauma. And then the recovery is the goal, that our work is to create what I call 3 pillars: safety, creating safety environment, creating a sense of connection. We as adults are primarily the most important thing in those kids' lives, and any one of us can make a difference between maybe that child ending up incarcerated and addicted to drugs or becoming a Rhodes Scholar. It's the way that they experience the adults in their lives that see them and recognize them and often can help them become who they're meant to be. When I do my work as a clinician, I always ask people who have had trauma, who was the person in their life that saw them? And sometimes it was a teacher or or a resource officer. Sometimes it was a coach or the next door neighbor. Oftentimes for a lot of the kids that I worked with and have worked with worked with here at Amos House, it hasn't been the parent because the parent was traumatized, him or herself, but there might have been somebody that really saw something in them, and that you can be that person for these kids, and that's really incredibly important. The other thing that's really important is that when we're working with kids that have experienced any kind of trauma, that might be acting out their trauma by becoming belligerent and defiant and angry and destructive, is that as much as we can give them a choice in how they can be responded to, give them some sense of control, the better the outcome will be. So much of what happens from trauma is that you feel incredibly helpless, and somebody who should have protected you has taken all your power away and has hurt you. So when we begin to work on getting people kind of back to a healthy place, we have to work on giving them choices and making them feel a sense of importance and value. We're going to show a video, and it's not easy. This video is, you're going to be listening to some folks that had spent quite a lot of time incarcerated because of their own decision-making after having experienced trauma. But as you're watching the video, I want you to be thinking about, what are they saying? How do they describe themselves? What are the symptoms that you're seeing? And also, because of the work that you're doing, begin to listen to, as they talk about their stories of childhood trauma, think about the kids that you're working with and see if you can recognize any of their stories and any of the kids that you're working with, so that we can begin to talk about how to begin to counteract the traumas that many of our kids are experiencing. Any questions? All right, so go ahead, Molly. Can you start the first video? All right, so I think you got enough of it to get a gist of kind of those experiences. So I was going to put you in small groups, but I think we'll stay in the large group for this one. And just like, what did you hear? What were some of the symptoms that you heard? What were some of the messages that you heard those adults get about who they were as kids?
I think it's interesting, Eileen, just the cyclical pattern within the families where there's abuse at home and it leads to abuse outside of the home. And was that a Rhode Island produced film?
No.
No.
Other comments?
Seems like a survival technique, fight or flight. You either
Yep.
beat off or get picked on, because the next person has to prove that they're tougher than you.
That's right. Yeah. What else did you hear?
Just that basically they all used violence. They didn't stop and try any other method. Everything was just violent around them.
So the violence was their survival technique. Yeah. Yeah.
You also had the gang acceptance, having that close family, someone to watch over them, protect them.
She got big. PJ says, I got big. I got jumped into it, but I also then got loved. I got, beat into the gang, but then I also got loved. So when you think about sort of the kids that you're working with, like, what do you hear from their stories about when they were adolescents that you're seeing with the kids that you're working with, if anything?
A lot of it is the lack of words, the lack of ability to kind of cognitively explain what's happening to them. So they're acting out in the only way that they know how. And
what behaviors are you seeing, Ashley?
A lot of the kids that I work with are tantrum behaviors, or a lot of times they'll push and fight with their siblings or foster siblings or whatever it might be. But defiance, a lot of that sort of thing.
Yeah. And what are some of the subtle things that you might see or hear? Because it's not always, sometimes it's easier to recognize the kids that are acting out because it's pretty obvious. But we also see kids act out in other ways too. And what are some of the other ways?
I think when you see the loner in the school, the person's that's all alone, withdrawn, almost
Yep.
depressed, sad, etc.
Yep. 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 Yeah. The withdrawal. Yeah. Okay.
We
Yeah.
had done a presentation last year in high school, and a girl in ninth grade came forward, said she came home from school 4 times, was able to revive her mother from an overdose 3 times, and on the 4th time she was unsuccessful.
Yeah.
I mean, just sweet young girl, and I was just amazed.
Very standoffish, argumentative. That's right. Yeah. 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 And, what you're going to see is a real lack of trust, and often hypervigilance, because when you've been exposed to repeated trauma, physiologically, your body gets wired to be on that sort of automatic waiting for the next fight. And so we often don't understand why kids are so hyper vigilant and dysregulated, and so they're sort of very high strung. And physiologically, what we have to recognize is that when you have had repeated trauma, your body's physiology actually changes and it stays in that hyper aroused state. And so part of the work is to recognize when you see somebody like that, that there's a reason why they're hypervigilant, and you have to we have to work with them to lower their hyper aroused state to a baseline level where they can actually hear and take in new information. And you're right, I just saw in the chat somebody said poor academic performance. So imagine that you're living in a household where there's drinking and fighting every night, and then you come to school the next day. How do you pay attention in the class? Because when you've had trauma, you're just going to be preoccupied all day with, is my mom safe? What's going to happen at home? And so your kid's sitting in the classroom and getting labeled with an attention deficit disorder or some other, kind of label, when actually their whole focus is on, I have to worry about what's going to happen when I get home. What if there's no food in the house and I have to worry about making sure that my younger brothers and sisters eat? So often we don't ask the questions about trauma, and we don't understand that, kids are presenting with these problems, but it's really their response to their trauma that's making them show up this way. Okay, so let's talk about some of these signs. And we can see these in kids, adolescents, adults. Sometimes we'll see them in ourselves because many of these also mimic vicarious trauma when we're bringing our own traumatic experiences into the work. You'll see a kid that doesn't seem to have any interest and they've sort of given up. They're no longer engaged in the activities that they might have previously wanted to be involved in. You also might see the kid that is trying to please everybody and, trying really hard to make sure that they do everything right. I often call those kids the trackers. They sort of very quickly learn how to see what the adults need and want. And so they watch them really carefully and they respond ahead of time before you can even ask for anything, because that's the way they protect themselves from getting hurt, is that they kind of jump ahead of time and they're just always waiting to see what the next thing is going to be. And we often treat those kids as, oh, they're so good. But meanwhile, they're doing this kind of hyper nervous reaction to being afraid of getting hurt. They're often the kids that get labeled as, sort of the teacher's pet because they're always trying to please. They'll also always try to please their friends, which is what leads to kind of them getting into trouble and, with peer pressure and things. The hypervigilance we talked about. You'll see a lack of creativity, just kind of not being able to actually let go of the worry enough to be able to get lost in a hobby or reading or writing or drawing. Kids get very rigid. That's the inability to live in kind of the gray area. So these kids get very righteous sometimes, and they're, everything is about right or wrong. And they can't relax, they can't they might be telling their peers what they're doing wrong. And it's often because they have to hold on so tight to their sense of control, or they're minimizing. David, you talked about that girl that came in and said, I went home 3 times and revived my mom. Well, in some ways, she had to minimize the effect of that experience in order to get through it. There's that sense of, you'll see physical ailments, the kid that's chronically sick all the time. Maybe we need to ask, is there something going on at home? Is there a reason why you're always going to the nurse's office? Like, are you, because our bodies keep the score, our bodies become physically, embraces our stress, inability to listen, having to be right. So you don't often see dissociation in kids because that usually comes later on, but you might see, sort of a slight dissociation where a kid seems to be preoccupied and not paying attention. A lot of guilt. A child believes that they're the center of their adult's universe, right? That's not, kind of the self-centeredness. It's age appropriate for kids to believe that the world revolves around them, right? So with that comes a belief that if my mom or my dad is hurting me, well, then there must be something I can do to make that change and make that stop. Because if mom really loves me, she won't hurt me. So I must be bad or I must be wrong. So kids begin to work really hard to try to please and make sure that the hurt stops. But with long-term trauma, with sexual abuse, it's actually life-saving for a kid, because if you truly had to believe that the person who loved you is really going to hurt you and doesn't love you, well, then you really lose a sense of hope, right? So if you keep thinking that there's something I can do to change that, if I'm only better, if I only work harder, if I only try harder, then you keep hope alive that somehow sooner or later you'll get it right, right? And you'll find the right magic to make mommy stop hurting me or daddy stop hurting me. So in some sense, holding on to that is really incredibly important for kids. Once they truly get to a point where they believe that they're unloved, well, that's when hopelessness really sets in. And then what? Then why bother? Why live? Why care? Why not hurt myself? I don't matter anymore. Okay, so any comments on any of these? Do you see any of these signs in the folks that you're working with and the kids that you see? And in which ways do they show up?
I definitely see the kids and I'm talking from the East Greenwich world too. So I don't have really, families that are looking for the next meal and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But just the procrastination, this time of year, senior projects are coming up and the kids are just so overwhelmed, not to mention with adding the COVID stuff, but just everything in school and outside of school, they're just, it's like, no, you gotta get going here. You're gonna have to present soon, and you gotta get everything written up, and just the procrastination, trying to hide from it.
Yeah. And Chris, what do you think the procrastination is about? If you look at these kids, because I think you're right. Sometimes it's typical adolescent procrastination, but there might be something else going on too.
Correct. It's just it's the fear of just hankering down and getting it done, or maybe the fear of just the inability to be able to do it.
Yeah, and I also think that we definitely know that COVID has created so much a sense of isolation and lack of connection among lots of kids. And we're seeing more depression, we're seeing more anxiety, we're seeing kind of a sense of, is this ever going to end? They're losing so much of the rite of passage that adolescents and young kids should have, the events, the activities, the community. And so there's like more withdrawal, that even touch, we are beings deprived of touch right now. And we are not going to realize the effect of this for quite a while, about all the ways in which our bodies are deprived of the human touch that makes us feel alive and connected. You know, we're all talking to each other through screens. And that is going to have a lifetime effect on especially kids where there's not somebody helping them manage that as they're sitting in their room for 12 hours a day on a laptop. So if they're not in a family or home where somebody's helping them talk about what that feels like, they're internalizing all of this, and we're going to see more depression, more anxiety, more kids turning to pills and, you know, and drinking and other forms of medication. You know, we've seen it across the state. We have higher rates of opioid overdoses now than we've had in 3 years, because people are really suffering. So those are the kinds of things that you might see, like in East Greenwich, where, you know, kids are drinking their, you know, their dad's alcohol in the house, and, you know, it's not showing up in other ways, but that's a problem, right?
Is that video showed in the high schools? The video we
Yeah,
just watched?
it could be, but if we did a training with it, but yeah, this is part of the SAMHSA training, and there's some more I'm going to show you, but it's very powerful, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be great to have, you know, the necessary counselors and people in the schools, and have the kids watch this just to get a better understanding of their peers and what some kids may be going through.
Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Kathy, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just worry that with COVID that, you know, young people don't have that person that sees them.
That's right.
And often it is like an SRO who might just, you know, bust their chops every day, or someone like a student assistance counselor who sees them, and checks in with them. Hey, how's everything going? Or it's a coach, or a, you know, not having access to sports, or their drama, or whatever that thing is that isn't their parents and isn't home. And I think that I worry the long-term effect of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Anything else that anybody saw or want, or those signs? Are you noticing those signs in any of the kids that you're working with? I mean, Ashley, the clinician, is shaking her head yes, because yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's ways in which, you know, clinicians are at least getting the kids on the Zoom or in the, you know, in the room. I think for you guys, people are not necessarily coming up to you to tell you that they're struggling. You're going to be looking for the signs of what they're not saying, because, you know, our kids often try to avoid being seen when they're having a hard time. So it's particularly important for you to be trauma responsive and looking for signs that, you know, sort of that somebody's trying to communicate to you. All right, I'm going to show you another video. This is, I want you to again to, I also coach and see some of that at times with the athletes. Yes. Yeah. You know, who particularly with athletes, what do you see kind of particularly in terms of the way that they show signs of trauma?
I'm thinking of one in particular, but someone who's typically very bubbly and loud becomes very withdrawn and visibly upset and isolates and will not reach out when that's not her common demeanor.
And I think the thing right now, which is different, is you know, the other is that we've seen so much unrest in our world, not only with COVID, but racial unrest and political unrest, and all of that is traumatic. That's kind of going to show up as historical trauma, you know, 10, 15, 20 years from now. But we also need to pay attention to how that's affecting all of us. And we all, no matter what political party we're a part of or what we believe in, there's so much political trauma happening in our country that is impacting all of us. And, you know, I think for you all who are officers, I'm imagining that you carry a tremendous amount of that trauma, because in so many ways you've had to become so protective of your position, and the ways in which the world has looked at the police and officers. And how does that then show up in the way that you carry yourself, or the way that you enter your job? And do you get to a point where you feel hopeless and helpless and angry? And how does that then impact the work that you're doing? I can only imagine that it's a very difficult time to be a police officer in this country. And, just how we internalize that, how you're internalizing all of that anger and unrest. And what does that mean when you show up to work and a kid mouths off at you, or somebody, gets belligerent when you're trying to get them to do something? Like, how do you manage that, your own kind of hypervigilance around having to protect yourself from the world that right now can be very angry?
You can hear me okay?
Yep.
I think it's just important that we continue to be positive role models in the school and not change who we are.
Yeah.
Continue good mornings, what's going on, buddy, and make everything as normal as it always has been.
Yep.
I think if we change who we are as officers, then the kids are going to feel that tension and feel that disconnect. So I think it's just important we continue to be who we are.
Yep, absolutely. That's a really good point, Jill. Do others feel the same way? Kind of just still showing up and being who you are, and hoping that that will continue to help you develop meaningful relationships with the kids? Yep. James says, yep. Okay. All right, so we're going to move to a next video that's going to dive a little bit deeper in sort of how trauma has manifested in some of these adult lives. So again, we're going to be looking at the behaviors that people are talking about and how that might link back to their trauma, and just also how their relationships have been damaged because of their early childhood trauma, and what they use to cope. Remember, a lot of the behavior that we see kids acting out is their ability to cope. It's their best defense to survive things that might feel really hard. So we heard a lot of different ways that folks manage their traumas. So what feels relevant to all of you and to what you might see or hear in the kids that you're working with?
So in the last few school years, we've had numerous instances of many of those recollections from the people in the video, to include a young girl who was cutting. She's now with James at the high school, but she was previously with myself the last 2 years. Another girl who endured trauma at home as a young child and subsequently got involved with prescription drug abuse.
Yep.
Also currently with James at the high school, but previously the last 2 years she was at, Curtis Corner with me. So we get to see a whole host, pretty much the entire variety of issues and experiences at our two schools.
So when you see kids that are using substances, what's your approach? How do you work with somebody like that?
Well, hopefully you have a decent rapport with them prior to that, because if you don't have the rapport and there isn't that level of trust, then they're not going to divulge anything to you.
Right.
We're very fortunate in our schools because we have a really great assisting workers with us as far as mental health clinicians. And it enables at least someone within our school will have a rapport with most students. And if I'm not personally able to make inroads with them when an instance comes up, they have someone that they can lean on, and in a team form, we can get them.
That's right. Yeah. 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 And I think that's terrific that it really, it doesn't matter who the person is that has that initial connection, as long as somebody does. And then that starts the connecting for supports. And one of the things that's really important is to, when we often see behaviors like substance use is a prime one, we tend to immediately want to address the substance use as the issue. And what we have to do is we actually have to tell folks that we understand that drinking or using pills or smoking weed was your best attempt to manage what was really hard. You didn't know that there could be other ways to manage that. So we first acknowledge that the trauma created a response. Many people started using because of trauma. And if we immediately move to try to address the use, the substance use, and treat that as bad behavior that needs to be stopped, then that person is going to go deeper into hiding the trauma, because they're going to be reacting to you or reacting to their drug use or to their alcohol use or to their cutting classes or whatever it is. So what's so important is that our response is to say to anybody who's exhibiting behavior, what is your behavior trying to tell me? Because that's really what we need to learn. Why are you behaving this way? What's the story that you're trying to tell me? Because it's really not about the acting out behavior. That's just the symptom or the manifestation of what the symptom is. And just think about how often we immediately go to respond to the behavior, and then somebody gets really defensive or withdrawn or they shut down. Imagine a world where we became curious with the folks that we're working with and really curiously asked, so what are you trying to communicate? And can we think, is it working for you? You know, I tell people all the time here when they come to Amos House, of course you use drugs. That was your best attempt to get through what was a horrific, horrible life situation, but it's not working anymore. Now we have to find other ways to help you manage that. And if you can begin to have those conversations with teenagers, God, you can prevent them from ending up at Amos House in 15 years. Because it's really about, so you're really struggling because something's happened to you, that life has been hard for you, and you're worried and you're scared. I get it. I get why you would want to do that. You know, I've worked with so many teenagers who have eating disorders, who cut, who start using drugs. All of that is their way of crying out for help, right? But what are they saying? What are we needing to ask? And how do we look beyond initially that behavior? Because if we can connect with what's underneath the behavior, then we have hope that we can begin to help people find alternate solutions that are more positive. Because part of what we need to know about adolescents is that developmentally, their job is to take risks, right? Developmentally, they're at a point in their life where they're trying to break away from parents. They're trying to create their own identity. They're trying to separate and find out who they are. So it's a time of experimenting, you know, the blue hair, the transgender, the clothes, the earrings, the tattoo, all of that is an attempt for self-expression. Some of the behaviors are dangerous and some behaviors are just temporary and risk-taking and maybe okay. And we have to recognize that that's the normal process of adolescence, to help them move through that phase of their life where they're trying to figure out who they are in the world and separate their identity from the identity that they've had from the family of origin that they're living in. So part of the work is to figure out what's healthy risk behaviors and help them develop those, because they have to develop the risky behaviors in order to become fully realized as adults. So what are some of the healthy behaviors that you can help kids do? What are some of the things that you're seeing with kids as they're beginning to experiment?
I've seen like working out,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
but that's sometimes they take that too much where they get obsession where they have to measure their food and just working out too much.
Yeah, but it starts as I want to, feel good about my body and I want to be strong. And, then they might start taking steroids because, that they can really be pumped. You're right. But it starts out as, yeah, absolutely. What other kinds of things do you see? Like what are the kids showing? What are they wearing? I'm sure each town is different, but what kind, how do they express themselves? What music are they listening to?
So because I get to work at 2 middle schools, I get to see 5th through 8th grade. So you get to see a natural progression in
Yeah.
patterns of behavior. You get to see how, like you were alluding to, their style develops, how the groups of people that they hang out with between 5th and 8th grade may change.
Yep.
Often for the better, sometimes for the worse. So you get to see the natural progression in their development as a unique entity, an individual, in a 4-year span of school.
That's right. Yeah, right. So you're going from pre-adolescence through adolescence and then, yeah. Right. Yeah. There's also, this is, the time where they're going from concrete thinking to abstract thinking, where they can begin to have their own opinions and worldviews. And again, if somebody's had a lot of trauma, that development from concrete to abstract thinking gets arrested, and they're not developing those skills, that ability to reason and think logically. All that gets arrested when kids are preoccupied because there's trauma going on in their lives. And so then we're really going to see them stop moving forward in that process. And when we often start working with somebody who comes into recovery in their 20s, we'll ask them what age they started using drugs and alcohol. And if they're saying 14, 15, developmentally, they're often arrested at 14 and 15. So they're a 40-year-old, but their relationships are immature or non-existent because they stopped developing the ability to move into healthy relationships because of their drug use. So part of the work is often to figure out, if you're in the high school or sort of in, middle adolescence or late adolescence, developmentally, where is this kid? Like if there's been a lot of trauma, you'll see a 15-year-old who is emotionally like a 12-year-old. And so you have to treat them like a 12-year-old emotionally, but understand that they still need time to develop. So you're saying, we talk about kids being immature and not responsible. And we use labels like that because you're 18 years old, you're an adult now. Well, guess what? We've learned from brain science that our brain is not fully developed till like 24, 25 years old. We used to think, for those of us who are old like me, I was at 17, I was living on my own. I was fully developed, right? We used to think that by 18, you were an adult. How many of you have kids that are 18? Are they adults? Yeah, are they adults, James? Or no, right. So we have to remember that our understanding of brain development has also grown tremendously over the last 20, 30 years. And we recognize that what we thought at 18 often isn't happening till, 25. I mean, I still have a 27-year-old living with me who I wish was ready to move out. So what is this kind of, what are you thinking? Like, is this, are you recognizing the kids in any of this that you're working with?
I see a lot of kids that like think they're adults.
Yes. Yeah.
And will try to act adultish, but they're just not there yet.
Yes. And Chris, part of their age appropriate development is to act as if they're adults because they so much want to be adults. And the trick is how to kind of continue to help them grow while giving them little bits of freedom to begin to own that responsibility of being adults. And again, that's back to recognizing what is healthy risky behavior and what is unhealthy risky behavior, because they're going to take risks. AJ, what did you say?
It says a lot of them attempt to make adult decisions because of the lack of adults in their life.
Yes, right. Yeah. Yeah. We talk about parentified children. Does everybody know what that means? Those are kids that have had to take on the role of adults, the caregivers in their families. So they assume this kind of adult responsibility when they're still kids. And they get labeled as sort of caretakers. And again, those kids might look better on the outside because they're acting very adult-like. But I often talk to them and, sort of and say, well, it's like your Swiss cheese. You know how Swiss cheese has all these holes in it? There's parts of you that are developed. You look like you're fully developed, but emotionally, there's gaps in your development because you had to skip over that ability to, to be a kid and not to be in charge.
Kathy asks if you can give more examples of healthy risk taking for adolescents.
Yes, yeah. So healthy risk taking, things like dyeing your hair blue is a healthy behavior, right? We freak out when we're parents when our kids come home with, shaved, half of their head shaved. That's actually a kind of a pretty safe, risky behavior. Joining a theater club, working out, joining sort of a club, going skydiving, going snowboarding, and again, different kids have different opportunity, playing basketball, kind of becoming an advocate and an activist where you're fighting for something you believe in. Things like that, joining, sort of the gay and lesbian club at school. Like there's lots of those kinds of things where you get to take a stand on things that are not going to hurt you. Getting a job, getting a car, getting a driver's license. Those are healthy things to be doing. Athletes expressing themselves through pin and poke tattoos. That's right. Absolutely, Ashley. Yeah. Yeah. They're putting gauges in your ears that as parents, you're going to freak out because they're ugly. But, kids are expressing themselves by doing that. Changing friends. You're going to see, when somebody changes their friend group, there's often a sign that there's a lot going on. It's not just in novels where, kids break up into either the bad kids at school or the good kids at school. That really does happen. And we have to pay attention to who the kids are hanging out with. Being identified as, sort of one of the cool kids. And then what kind of behaviors does that kid have to do in order to stay a part of that? Looking at the way kids are dressing. I mean, I remember when I have 4 kids, and one of them when she was 15, all she wore was black. She painted her room black. She was listening to very dark music, and she was very depressed. And by the way she was dressing and expressing herself, she was trying to tell everybody how depressed, My Chemical Romance was her favorite band. And she was really, really depressed. And it was a really rough period for her. We're going to see that with our kids. And you need to kind of listen to what they're listening to. Are they listening to very angry music? What are they trying to say? So those are all the things that, and again, our job is not to stop a lot of that behavior. Our job is to become curious with them about why they're doing what they're doing and have them kind of talk to you about what that means for them. What does that music make you feel? How do you feel when you listen to that music? Not going to school. That's going to be considered risky behavior. But what if somebody's trying to tell you that they're really bored and they don't like their classes or they're having trouble in a class? client latching on to animal, yeah, animal, yes, yep, and that's a big thing around, with young folks now. I don't really understand it, but I know it's big with young folks. I think we should take a break for like 10 minutes. Everybody get a cup of coffee, take a stretch, and we'll come back in 10 minutes.
I really like that video. Like I look at, what the schools are doing or aren't doing. It's like we do presentations for substance abuse prevention, and we don't really stop to address and look at the trauma that
Yep.
has led to the behavior. Do you feel like schools are doing enough to address the trauma that leads to bad
No.
behavior? I just look at that video, I think it's just a phenomenal piece for kids to realize that
Yeah.
everybody doesn't grow up the same. There's all different circumstances.
Yep.
I think that's important.
Yeah. I also think that trauma is universal and it's not just in poor communities. And I think we sometimes we mix up class with experience. And, it's interesting because for a long time when I was doing therapy, I worked with a lot of brown students that were incredibly smart and intellectual, but had absolutely no ability to put their feelings into words. They were all head, no heart. And that is a different kind of trauma, when you work with kids whose lives have been so prescripted and they're told exactly who they're supposed to be and what they're going to be doing. And it's all about their performance. And the second they fail at something, they fall apart. That's also difficult for kids. And we see that in some of the higher achieving schools where kids are about to have a nervous breakdown because there's so much pressure. And maybe that's some of the procrastination around getting their work done that Chris was talking about, because maybe if it's not going to be perfect, then they're not going to get into that college they want to go to. And so they completely deteriorate and decompensate because they get so emotionally dysregulated.
Yeah, so how would you implement something like this into the high schools? I mean, it'd be great if it was a mandatory, class or whatever it would be, just to kind of give kids the tools to recognize and deal with, not only in themselves, but in others.
Yeah, I think it starts with staff understanding trauma. I mean, I do this trauma training. I did it for our entire staff at Amos House because the receptionist, as well as the guy that cleans the floors, who's interacting with our guests, our clients, needs to know how they approach people makes a difference. And that when you assume that trauma is universal and that people are going to have kind of reactions to being aggressively approached, no matter what position, if we don't understand why people might be acting aggressive, then we are not opening up the possibility for people to be their best selves. So part of it is creating an environment that's got, loving kindness at its center. And it can happen, a guy on the soup kitchen line who, gets pushed out of the way, turns around and, punches somebody. Well, think about BJ talking about, I can't tolerate anybody being behind me because it triggers me. Like you might have kids pushing and, arguing because somebody got into their space. You'll hear that all the time around, with adolescents. Don't get in my space, right? Because that space is very important for them in terms of their self-protectiveness. And when we get in people's spaces, even when we approach them in a way that's not trauma informed, we can re-traumatize somebody.
Thank you.
Kathy?
Eileen, I was just put in the chat, but I know that more schools are working to become trauma informed, which is just what you were saying, training all staff through professional development about the issues we're talking about today. But we still, I know West Warwick is working on that as a designation, and I know other schools have as well, but there's still a long way to go. And I think, unfortunately, we focus on middle school and high school level, and really we need to start at a much younger level.
Yep, that's right. Because we don't know what that kid who's showing up at school experienced at home the night before. We often don't know. And the kid who's sitting in that chair that is so quiet because they're preoccupied with what was going on the night before, and they're so worried. You heard that, one of the Tina, I think it was, who said, I felt somewhat relieved when my father was in prison because I didn't have to worry about coming home and finding my mom beat up again. That's a reality of, too many of our kids. I mean, we know statistically that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys will have experienced trauma. That's an incredible number of people. And so it's very universal. And again, what's important is to recognize that the earlier you get somebody to be able to have a safe place to talk about it and work it through, the less likely you're going to see so many of the destructive behaviors that we saw in these videos. It's because nobody was there to help them manage the emotional response to trauma. When I talk to folks about trauma and hypervigilance, one of the examples I often use is if I've had traumatic experiences in my life and I'm hyper vigilant, my body response has been hyper aroused. If a lion jumped in that window, what would we all do? Our fight, flight, flee response would go into activation, right? When you've had tremendous amount of trauma, and maybe not even, depending again, how you reacted to every experience to trauma. If a kitten jumps in the window, guess what? I react as if it's a tiger or a lion, because our body is reacting to the traumatic experience as if it were the original trauma. So part of the work is to bring down people's regulation so that they truly see that it's a kitten coming in. And when you're trying to talk somebody off the ledge, you have to recognize that it may not be about the behavior that's right in front of you. It may be a long trigger of behaviors that brought you to this moment. So again, stepping back and becoming curious about, why is this kid having such a negative reaction? I just asked him to put his book bag in the locker, and he's flipping out at me and he's kicking the locker and he's screaming. Like, why do you think he's doing that? Well, maybe that sound of your voice or the closeness that you got to him triggered something that he's been carrying around forever. And the other thing to understand about trauma is that, again, we talked a little bit earlier about how trauma memories are stored. You heard in the video when they talked about being triggered with sight, smell, taste, touch. Our hypothalamo and our amygdala is where we store the traumatic memories, not in our cognitive brain. And the way that sometimes scientists talk about it, it's sort of like if you think about a toilet pipe that doesn't flush and it clogs, one traumatic memory comes on top of another one. And all of a sudden you've got this long pipe filled with, let's say, that's trauma memories. And then we don't know how to, when we have a new trauma, our alarm system goes off, and then we respond to the new trauma based on that file cabinet or that pipe of all the old traumas. And so the alarm goes off and we're seeing a 12, truck fire alarm when it might be a candle lit. So we have to break it down for folks so that they can begin to recognize that right now, here in the moment, I'm safe. So we do a lot of kind of grounding techniques. Where are you right now? We work on safety and present and getting back to the present moment. And sometimes, just by putting your touch, for some people, just by tapping them, it brings them back. For others, tapping them might trigger them. So you also have to know who you're talking with. Again, I often use this tool directly with folks that have had trauma as a way to help them understand what's happening in their bodies. So you have a trauma event, So again, it's an overwhelming physical or psychological response to something. And then we develop coping skills. Sometimes we develop negative coping skills like using drugs or alcohol. Sometimes we develop positive coping skills like learning how to run. And then you have your response to trauma, the fight, flight, freeze. You guys probably know that better than anybody as police officers, that, that's what we're looking for all the time. How are people responding to trauma? And then we also have what we call that altered state of consciousness, our body sensations, numbing, the hypervigilance, the hyperarousal that usually leads to some sort of collapse. And then if you look at what happens to the nervous system, we teach people that their whole nervous system changes. So there's an actual change in the chemistry in the brain. There's more cortisol produced that is kind of the fear response, and that stays in the brain over time, which can change the brain and the brain's response. So there's that brain body connection where if you've got increased hormones that are hyper aroused, then you're on hyper alert, so you can't relax. Your body doesn't know how to come back down. So you're always in that sort of tense, holding your muscles, not breathing. I'm always talking to people about breathing, because people who are afraid don't realize that they're walking around holding their breath. Everybody right now do a body check and notice where your breathing is. We don't often realize how often we're holding our breath, or our breath is right up here in our upper chest, and we're not really taking a breath. So imagine what happens to your body when you're holding your breath. All of your muscles are tightened, your blood pressure is rising, you're getting sweaty, and then just think about being in that altered place all the time. It's exhausting. And then eventually your body just has to collapse. And then there's the psychological and physical distress. So the current stressors remind us of past stress triggers, past trauma, images, memories come in all kinds of different forms. Just right now, close your eyes and think about Christmas. What's the what's the smell that you come to? Think about winter. What does that smell like? You saw that woman who said how she would take a walk in the cold and then she would dissociate because it would remind her of the time and place where she was being molested. Sometimes somebody can walk in a room that's wearing cologne that reminds them of their abuser, and all of a sudden they're right back there, right? So those are the most powerful sensations that bring us right back to our trauma. And sometimes we don't even know why we're responding to trauma, because nobody's taught us that smell reminds you of a time in your life when that was painful, but you don't have to get lost in that time anymore. You can ground yourself and come back to the present. So our emotional and physical responses lead to these different responses. Some people retreat and they go into isolation, dissociation, they get depressed, get anxious. Sometimes it leads to harmful behavior, which, substance use, cutting, harm, suicide thoughts, eating disorders. Sometimes we see aggression, violence against others. A lot of that we heard in the very first video, how many of those men were talking about how you had to be either if you weren't the prey, you had to not be the prey, you had to be the predator. Remember he said that? That's often how people respond. I'm going to show them that they can't take advantage of me. Ultimately, this leads to physical health issues. We see lung disease, heart disease, autoimmune disorders, obesity, things like fibromyalgia and irritable bowel syndrome. Often people that have those diseases, when you trace back, often that they've had traumatic histories. And so we have to recognize when somebody presents with these physical illnesses, asking the question, has anything ever happened in your life that was hard? Really makes a difference in how we treat them too, because it's not always about treating the medical issues, it's also about treating the emotional and psychological issues. So what thoughts do you have? And you can use that handout with kids that you're working with.
Can I ask a question? Because all of those make sense to me, except the autoimmune disorder. That one I always struggle with and go, but how? I mean, I understand heart because you're anxious and
Yep. So I think stress actually can cause many autoimmune disorders, because again, it changes the hormones in your body. Like, think about alopecia, hair loss. The stress is the number one, and that's an autoimmune disorder. It's the number one cause is stress when people get bald spots. It's just, it's the way that, and again, I'm not a scientist, but it affects the chemistry in your body gets altered. And you can begin to see some of this with kids. Obesity in classrooms among kids eating. I'm working with a 12-year-old who was sexually abused. She's been in and out of foster care. She's reunited with her mom now. Her mother has long histories of abuse and has lost her multiple times. And her mom's locking food up because she can't keep her from eating in the middle of the night. And she's eating like dried pasta and all kinds of things. Like, that's a reaction to her trauma. And her mother just wants to lock the food up and say, I can't afford you to keep eating all this food, without really understanding that this kid is saying, I'm scared you're going to leave me again. I want to have control over something. Eating disorders is a very common thing when there's been trauma in somebody's childhood. It's the ultimate attempt to control. Either I'm going to control what comes in my body by not taking calories in, or I'm going to control how I manage. I take it in and then I get rid of the feeling by bulimia. It's the ultimate control. And you know that. I'm sure you're seeing lots of kids in schools have eating disorders. More prevalently, we see it among girls, but there's also been an increase in adolescent boys with eating disorders. Okay, all right, let's move on. So this one is going to be this is specifically for David, who's so absolutely interested in substance use. So here, this is a very short clip that's going to talk about how people turn to substances as a way of coping with trauma. So that was the risk. That wasn't the substance abuse one. Sorry, that's the next one. But what I do want to also talk about is that what there are three parts to abuse. There's the perpetrator, who is the one who causes the hurt. There's the victim who experiences the abuse. And then there's the kind of the passive bystander, the parent that maybe saw what was going on, but because of his or her own experiences, looked the other way. And what happens when somebody's had trauma, they internalize all these three different parts. So sometimes somebody who's been victimized continues to put herself into situations where she's getting hurt over and over again. And truly, it's sort of an attempt, an unconscious attempt to have a different reaction, that something different's going to happen. And they don't even understand why they're putting themselves into the situation over and over again. Sometimes the victim becomes the perpetrator, becomes the one that's going to act on violence against others. That way of, I'm never going to let, this happen to me. I'm going to hurt you before you hurt me. And you see that a lot with angry teenagers who are hurt. They will lash out even before there's a reason to lash out. And that's sort of a way of you keep away from me. I'm going to hurt you before you can hurt me. And then we often act out the passive part of ourselves, where we just give up. We don't try. We don't protect ourselves. We don't say anything. That sort of when shows up in depression, where people just give up on their lives. And so when you're working with somebody who's had trauma, you have to help them understand that their behavior can show up in all these different ways. it's easy for people who have been traumatized to own the victimization part, because that's comfortable in some ways. I've been victimized, therefore I'm, always the victim. It's harder sometimes to recognize the ways that we show up as perpetrators and we hurt others, because that's not a good feeling. But when you look at the research and you look at how many times somebody who was victimized as a child grows up to become the perpetrator, it's pretty common. Often if you trace people who were abusers, they were hurt as kids too. So it's important when you're sort of sitting with somebody and you're recognizing that they're exhibiting these behaviors, that behind most of those behaviors, they were victimized. And they're demonstrating, they're manifesting their victimization in various ways. And so we have to keep that whole frame in mind when somebody approaches us, so that we become curious about what are they trying to tell us? What are they showing up with? Does that make sense? Because we're often much more comfortable talking about the person who's been victimized, and we often approach the person who's the perpetrator as being a mean bully. But remember what one of the people in the film said, hurt people, right? Don't we see that all the time? Don't we sometimes hurt people because we've been hurt? And it's important to recognize, again, instead of just responding to why Tommy hit Eddie, is to recognize that Tommy might be trying to show us that he's been hurt. And if we can get underneath Tommy's hurt, we're going to prevent him from continuing to be hurtful to others by addressing his own trauma. All right. Questions, or does this feel right when you think about people that you're working with? Have you seen all different parts of, like, kids that show up in all these different ways? I like James' thumb. Kathy?
I'm curious about, to hear from the officers, because, they're in a school trying to enforce the rules. And when someone throws a punch or whatever that violent behavior is, they're brought in, it's their role. So, I think this is about understanding the why behind the violence, but then the conflict for them about, you can't condone the behavior, even if you do understand why. So I'm curious about the conflict for them, if there's a conflict.
Yeah. And how do you respond to that kid that threw the punch? You have your responsibility as an officer, but what ultimately happens to that kid and your relationship with that kid?
I was just going to say, and a lot of times in those situations, it all depends on the actual situations. For example, we have some kids will hit somebody when they're not looking. That's a little different than two kids that have an agreement in the hallway or the bathroom, right? Nowadays, the big thing is these kids use their phone. So they text each other.
Oh, yeah.
And they say, hey, meet me in the bathroom. And then, somebody comes out with a bloody nose and we backtrack from there.
Yeah.
And, the best way to deal with a lot of these is intent. If somebody sucker shot somebody, as we call it, that's a real intent to hurt somebody. But if it's, two people meeting, we try to, I don't want to say, squash it, but we usually don't arrest anybody. We talk to the parents, we kind of bring everybody in and try to resolve it as it's already gotten to the point of violence. And I think it's just different in each situation. Each understands that,
right.
There's certain things they're going to do that are going to be handled in certain ways, and they know that. So, like, especially last year, we saw a lot of the meet me here, and then you look at each other's phone and they've kind of already agreed to do it. So it's kind of, and you just use that and you take it, and then it's a good way to meet kids too, because a lot of the time some of these kids are kids that aren't the frequent flyers, but they get caught up in something, whether it be relationship problems or stuff like that. So
they're fighting over a girl.
Right. I think each situation is just different as far as here, and that's pretty much one of the main things we deal with is that kind of stuff. But they're always seeming to be like one step ahead of us, and even when fights happen outside of school.
They know how to have a fight without getting thrown out of school.
Yeah, but there's always somebody videotaping nowadays too, and it always finds its way to myself or whoever.
Yeah.
Johnny and Joey a fight 2 days ago. Here's the fight, and somebody will email it from you from like some Hotmail account or something. And then So I think each situation is kind of different, if that helps.
Yeah. AJ was talking about it being a building block to a relationship with kids. And, I think it's particularly hard in today's world where there's zero tolerance and the movement to so quickly remove somebody from a school, how devastating that is for that kid when it could be, again, remembering that adolescents don't have a lot of impulse control. And part of what we're trying to do is teach them how to handle emotions differently. But if we expel them or, put them whatever out of, send them somewhere else, it reinforces the behavior more than it helps them learn a different way of handling it. And I would imagine that your hands are tied to some degree with a lot of the kind of the violence, the no tolerance rules that exist today.
I was just going to say too quickly, it comes down to the parents a lot of the times too, how far they want to push an issue.
Yep.
That's why the meetings are very important, where
you
have that relationships.
Yep.
Sometimes get the kids help, whether it be anger management or
that's right,
whatever situation may be. But a lot of times it comes down to the parents in those, as far as they kind of dictate to us exactly how they want us to handle situations.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I often say here when people mess up, oh, I'm so glad you did, because now we can teach you how to do it the right way, instead of discharge you the minute you mess up, which is typical in programs. The second somebody acts out, we discharge them rather than say, this is such an opportunity for us to learn how to do it differently. I'll tell you a personal story. My son, I have 4 kids, and my oldest, and they're all biracial, which does mean something in terms of the situation, but he was a freshman in a Catholic school, and some kid was bullying him, and he said he was going to fight him. So Andrew stupidly took a small pocket knife to school and kept it in his backpack because he wanted to protect himself just in case something happened. This is a long time ago. He's now 31. And another kid told the teacher that he had this pocket knife in his backpack, and he got expelled. And he never took it out of his bag. And he was devastated. He didn't even understand the seriousness of what he had done. Of course, I didn't know about it until afterwards. And the school said zero tolerance. We don't allow kids to have, any kind of weapon. And yet, it was really his terror of like, what am I going to get into? I don't want to have to fight this kid. And, trying to look tough in a school where there were not a whole lot of kids that looked like him. And it really was devastating. It's sort of, he was just absolutely shocked that this had happened. And, again, the school had a zero tolerance policy. And so there was not even, an opportunity for him to learn from that experience in that school and go on. And it was in April of the end of his first year. So it can be really hard. All right, so let's do the quick substance use one, and then we're going to move on to some trauma responses that are helpful. So what I want you to do now is, we talked about sort of trauma, and we talked about sort of all the negative ways that people express trauma. What I want us to spend a little bit of time is thinking about resiliency, because the flip side of risk behaviors and risk situations is resiliency. And so much of the work that we're doing is helping kids be resilient against trauma. So I want to put you into small groups for the next 5 or 10 minutes. And in your small group, I want you to sort of make a list of, in your mind, or somebody can jot them down, or sort of, what are some of the risk factors that can put a kid at risk, but what are also some of the resilient factors? Like, what gives a kid the resiliency to be able to survive and overcome and actually thrive? Because that's also really important for us. And a strength model is to look at how kids, such as David's, example earlier about this young girl who still was doing very well in school, even though what was going on at home was really pretty detrimental. So I think you have groups already assigned, right? So go in for, 7 minutes or so. All right, so who is in group 1? All right, somebody want to tell us what some of the reason? We'll just add on, we don't have to repeat everything you've heard, but if there's anything different after group 1 that you want to add on, that would be great.
I can talk about what we talked about. We talked about having like supportive relationships outside of the home, with whether it's coaches or somebody at the school, a good network of friends, anything like that is helpful. We also talked about kind of on the risk factor side with like helicopter parents not letting kids kind of navigate their own way, and that actually being detrimental to them. And a protective factor would be like small amounts of adversity in like controlled settings. So kids learn to fail a little bit, learn to kind of navigate the waters on their own and not.
That's really important. Group 2?
Oops. Group 2 was the one I think that was having some difficulties. Those were the guys who
don't have audio. All right, group 3?
Yeah, so we touched on a few different things. For one, like just maintaining a positive outlook and attitude, basically like being consistent every day, showing up every day. Some kids, I think that school's an escape for them, from what's going on at their house. And kids that are, that utilize like the guidance counselors, the SROs, and are making an effort to follow through with some things, will that would be really helpful in their resiliency too. And then we also talked about how like younger kids may not even realize what's going on just yet, like the elementary age, and may think that like everything going on in their life is completely normal and that's just how people are. And to realize, being able to educate or have them understand that, some things that are going on in their life may not be their fault. Might help them to have some resiliency as they get older, so. Yeah.
Good, great. That's a great list.
Do the schools share with the SROs like the at-risk kids and what's going on? Is that information shared with you guys?
I know in Narragansett schools we do. I have a pretty good relationship with the guidance counselors and also administration, and absolutely, if they're doing like a risk assessment on a kid or something like that, they'll usually include me or pull me aside and give me a quick heads up.
That's awesome.
Great. That's great. Yeah. Then you can do a lot of preventative work.
In East Greenwich, we actually have SST. It was like a weekly roundtable between the administration, me, guidance counselors, psychiatrists, social workers, and just kind of go through the gamut of, what we might expect for the week.
That's that's sort of the model that is recommended nationally, is to have sort of the child is the center, then the those concentric circles where the child is the center, then family, then community, school, then community, and having all those folks involved really makes a difference in outcomes. So that's fabulous that you're doing that. All right, group 4? Do we have a group 4?
Yep. Group 4, we talked about factors that affect risk or resiliency are do they belong to any groups or hobbies like music, athletics, art? So if they're not involved in anything, they might be high risk. If they are, they might be prone to be more resilient. Mentors, we talked about having teachers or teaching them ourselves. And having access to services.
Access to services, that's right. Absolutely. Is that everybody? I think that,
We had our group too.
Oh, Sophia,
And one of the risk factors we talked about that hasn't been mentioned yet was media exposure.
Yes.
And what kids are seeing, whether it's online or even in advertisements. And then one of the resilient factors that we talked about a little bit was like older siblings who are good role models. I know friends of mine and even myself, like my older sister means everything. So like her opinion means more to me than even like parents at sometimes, especially when you're younger.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting because even when, there's often sort of that decision that kids have to make. And, sometimes in the same family, some kids will go the path of taking risks and getting into trouble, where other siblings might say, I'm never going to do drugs. I saw what this did in our family. And part of that is also genetic factors like biology. Like some folks are born with more resilient factors than others, just as some folks will get autoimmune diseases where others won't. And there's not always a clear kind of understanding why. Like for many of us who have siblings, we might have a family where some siblings did really well and some didn't do so well. And it's kind of that saying where no two kids have the same parents. Did you ever hear that? In the same household? We all experience our parents and our environment from our own lens, and that may make a big difference in terms of outcome. I'm one of 7, and I have one sister her childhood was not my childhood. I don't know where she grew up, but we're often saying like, what is she talking about? It was not roses in the way that she remembers it. But that's her resilient factor in some way, her ability to kind of always look on the bright side. She often doesn't see, the things that are harder. So I think that's also really important. The other thing that I think can make a difference is that, when some folks grow up in a family where religion is part of their life, or something spiritual or something to believe in, that can make a difference in outcome. Sometimes we see the people with the most adverse experiences have the most faith and manage to get through some of the most horrendous situations, where somebody who might not have nearly as much resiliency because they don't have anything they believe in. So believing in something bigger than ourselves can really make a difference in how we survive things that are really hard. And there's actually quite a lot of literature on that as well. So great, good. So I think part of why I wanted you to think about this is that when you're in your schools, use your eyes and your lens to look at kind of what's the package that's coming with these kids. Like, what do you notice? Like, where are their connections, and what are they doing positively that can help them transform what might seem like overwhelming consequences or experiences? And, often when we're stuck, somebody else has to point out what our options are, because we can't see them. We all have blind spots. But if we can be the eyes for folks that are feeling overwhelmed to help remind them of what some of those resilient factors are, that can make a really big difference. We can use that same eye to determine the kids that are at greater risk and kind of saturate them with more positive opportunities. We tend to, kind of sometimes sort of treat the kids that are at risk in a different way than we treat the kids that are behaving in a more positive way. So maybe looking at the way that we respond to that risky behavior is sort of what we've been talking about throughout, just really trying to get them connected to services, helping them understand that their risk behavior, their negative behavior is really a cry for help and a way of us trying to notice them. All right, so I have one more video that I want you to look at, and we're going to listen to Robert's experience and Tina's experience, and both, as you're listening to them, they both had experiences where somebody saw something in them that helped them sort of get through a difficult situation. So I want you to listen for that, because that somebody is going to be you guys someday.
one day I was driving home from work. I went home, got my things. Me and my wife started arguing.
So here's where you guys get to show up. How are you that person in somebody's life? What did you hear were the differences in both Robert and Tina's experience?
I think they were in Roberts, he was expecting a certain reaction and he got a completely different one. And I think that, you know, as SROs, it's important that we have that same kind of calm reaction to things when kids are, you know, have anger or something like that.
It totally changed him, didn't it? And what were some of the resilient factors that you heard?
I know, I don't remember the female's name, but she said Tina wants to live she wanted to live a life worth living.
Yeah.
So she knew that she needed to get help. So just making sure that you have a future outlook, you know.
That regardless of what she was doing right now, that person, the judge, the teacher, her mom, showing up for her, carried her to the point when she was finally ready for change, which I think is really a very important thing to recognize, that sometimes we think we're not making a difference, that we're not seeing the change in the moment that we're wanting to see, but people remember how we treat them. Maybe not what we say, but just the feeling that we give them that makes them feel like they matter and that we show up for them. And that carries them sometimes throughout, even when they're still messing up, to the point where they're holding on to that. And then they're ready for change. And so your presence in their life now can make a difference in the long run.
And Eileen, just having gone to Amos House, I think you are everybody's mom there, and I know you have thousands of people. So I congratulate you on your outstanding efforts in working with this group that's been affected by a variety of traumas. You do awesome work.
Thank you, David. So, oh my gosh, like I said, I've got like 10 more slides, but I also recognize that people, for some psychological reason, ending a few minutes early will make you love me so much more than if we go to 12 o'clock.
And they'll come back next week.
So I do want to spend a couple of minutes. I always believe that I use this, what I call the experiential learning cycle, in anything that I teach or learn. And for me, it's really about learning new information isn't good enough. It's how I'm going to apply it. Like what now? What am I going to do now based on what I've learned? And, sometimes it's small, tiny little things that we might do differently. So if anybody can think about anything that you've heard, whether it's in the videos or my slides or listening to each other, that you will do a little bit differently when you go back into the classroom, what would that be?
Asking what triggered them, why they're acting the way they are.
Yep, that's really important, James. Thank you. Yep. Becoming curious with them.
Maybe learning a little family history before you try to figure it all out.
Yeah. I always use this image with folks where I'll say, come stand next to me, and have us both look together forward. Because what we want to do is we want to separate the behavior from the person. And if you're standing next to somebody and you'll say, so breaking that thing over there, what was that about? Because then it's not you are bad, the behavior was bad. And by having somebody sort of look outside of themselves next to you to look at that behavior, people can open their eyes to really become curious. And then they can have those aha moments like, oh man, you're right. I didn't mean to do that. I was just acting out. I was pissed off because, whatever happened last night or this morning. So trying to use kind of that technique of not going at somebody, but standing with somebody as you're together trying to understand their behavior. All right. Any last words of anything before we end? It's Friday. Even if it's freezing cold out, it's still a Friday.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, everybody. Well, I will see you all next Friday, and we're going to be talking about ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experience, and how to kind of measure that and help folks with that as well. It's sort of a continuation of this work. All right.